if you're not using this particular fish this season in your small little ponds that you're setting up, or maybe even your big pond, I think you're missing out on a lot of fun. So today's video, I'm going to tell you everything that I know about what I think is like the best aquarium fish, specifically for the pond setting. And yes, this is 100% a rice fish video, and trust me, before you click off this, if you do, you're going to regret it. I don't know when. It might be the end of the summer, it might be in 3 years from now, but just trust me, you're going to want to watch this. I just don't want you to miss out on all the potential fun you could be having this summer. So I know we've been doing a lot of pond videos recently, but it's better than me making this video in like the end of July and you see it then you can't really do much about it. But hey, let's jump right into it and let's start talking about rice fish. So these fish originate not from Ohio, but from Japan. These fish basically evolved alongside humans and is the primary reason for why they have such an adaptability as far as like cold and hot goes. Because if you think about it, a rice paddy, they're all over the place in different types of climates, but they can get really hot and they can also get really cold depending on what time of year it is. For whatever reason, the rice fish that we even have access to in the States, which isn't a very large selection, most of these fish seem to still possess those traits, despite the fact that the ones that we have access to are probably pretty much exclusively bred in captivity and have been for a little while. But anyway, that's why you have fish that can survive a pretty cold winter. This is also how they keep them in Japan. There's a lot of respect with the rice fish in Japan, and I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have a ton of different variety. Also keep in mind that rice fish are really meant to be viewed from above. That's why they're so great for ponds. Some of them look okay from the sides, but they're really going to shine when the sun's hitting them and you're viewing them from the top. Japan has an infinite amount of more really cool strains that I don't know if we're going to see access to in the States anytime soon. But that's a whole nother deep conversation for maybe another day. That is the reason why they're so good for particularly small ponds, but even big ponds in the States. If you want to learn more about mini pond world or patio pond world, however you want to think about it, last week's video was perfect. We went super in depth on all the ins and outs of the whole thing. So definitely check that out if you're interested in the whole pond thing. But let's keep talking about the rice fish and let's really dive in. Let's talk about this fish as we kind of go through a season. So we'll start in spring, right? And depending on where you live, spring might come a little bit faster than it might for other people like me. If you live in South Florida, spring might have already sprung in March. Like, I don't know. But for me, it really just depends on the year. Sometimes late April is really nice. Other times I have to wait until the end of May for things to really start kicking off. If you're brand new to rice fish and you're thinking about just getting them for the first time now and you didn't overwinter them like I did, I would probably wait until it's probably around like 50 degrees at night consistently. And I say that only because most of the fresh new fish that you get are probably tank raised and they've probably never been at temperatures like that before. So we're going to kind of wait until the daytime temperature is in the mid 70s kind of a deal. This isn't like a hard and fast rule. You don't have to follow this part of the advice at all, but like a lot of the fish that I was growing up over the winter, I'm kind of waiting until I get into more consistent warmer temperature before I just put them outside in the pond for the rest of the season. Again, not something that you absolutely have to do. They're a very hardy fish, and I'm sure even my juveniles that have been inside all winter could probably take it and be just fine. Once you get your pond set up though, you're pretty much ready for your rice fish. Like, they don't take any kind of special filtration. If you have a bunch of plants, like, you're good. Even if you don't have any plants and you're planning on just having like it turn into green water, also a great option. That's great for baby fish, and particularly if you're going to be breeding them. But I think most people, they aren't trying to have that. Like, if you have a patio pond, you want it to look good, chances are you want it to have a bunch of plants and to be an aesthetic thing that looks good. So you can still do the breeding regardless. It's just going to require a little bit more work because rice fish will deposit their eggs on anything in the pond. So any type of, if you have dwarf sage growing in your pond, if you have any type of floating plant, like even if the roots are shallow, they're still gonna rub their eggs off on that. But at this point, you can decide to just sit back, relax, and enjoy your fish, or you can engage with them more and go through the breeding process, which I think is a really fun thing to do. And I mean, who doesn't love free fish? Rice fish are prolific breeders. They're gonna do it pretty much every day from April to probably the end of October. I mean, that time window is going to shift a little bit depending on where you live. So if you want a bunch of free fish that are also awesome and that I think more and more people are wanting, whether or not you're going to sell them or not. I just think it's a really fun and engaging process, and it's something that I really got into last year. And your rice fish are going to breed no matter what pond they're in. It's just whether or not you want to get the babies or not, because they will eat like 99% of the fry that hatch out. You never know if your pond is super planted and there's a lot of hiding spaces, particularly up at the top, then you might have a few babies survive, and that's cool. But if you really want to maximize the amount of fry you're getting and you want to get into that breeding realm of things, then there's a bunch of tips and tricks that I have for you to really like bump those numbers up. The first thing you're going to want to do is create some type of a breeding mop. So you can use a lot of different things for this, but I think the easiest and the most fun way to do it is to create one using a little chunk of a pool noodle and then like a Scotch scrubbing pad. All you do for this is cut a little piece of a noodle and then take your Scotch pad, cut like almost all the way up vertically or horizontally, doesn't really matter. And then you roll that thing up, stick it inside the pool noodle, and then float those in the tank or pond. You know what I mean? Your rice fish are going to breed pretty much every single morning as long as there's more than, I think, around like 14 hours of light is what's triggering it right before the sun comes up pretty much every day. And then the female is going to, at some point, usually a few hours after that happens, rub those eggs off onto surfaces in the pond. So that's, again, why we have the breeding mop. It really helps if you don't have anything else in the pond, okay? Because these females, if you have even just a little group of floating plants, they're gonna rub off a portion of eggs onto that. Even if you have something that you don't think a fish would rub its eggs off onto, it's still probably gonna do it. So any type of plant in the tank, it's gonna take away from your mops. You might end up with a few on this mop when you check it, but you're definitely gonna have not as many as you could. So keep that in mind if you're really trying to maximize your yield of new fish. You want to have a bare bones pond. I know that's really boring, so this is what I came up with last summer, and it's what I'm gonna do, I think, most of the time again this summer. All I do for this is just come out in the morning, a couple hours after the sun's come up. Most of the females still have eggs on them, and I just scoop them up, put them into a little smaller tub that has a couple mops in it, and then just wait a few more hours. Eventually you come out, you see that none of the females have eggs on them anymore, and they're all just on those mops. You then just take the females, put them back into the pond. The water's the same, the temperature's the same, so there's no shock to the fish here. You don't have to worry about that. And then rinse and repeat and do this every morning that you want to do it. So it's kind of like a ritual thing for me in the morning. Every summer I come out, get some sun, collect some, move some female rice fish over, check, see how everybody's doing. It's a relaxing, kind of weird therapeutic fish thing for me to do. The eggs on the mops are going to start to hatch eventually. So the time frame for that is usually, I think the minimum amount of time is like 7 days. It might be up to 2 weeks. It just depends. So what I like to do is just either make a mental note or have a little rice fish calendar book, or I just write on the side of the tub, right? Like the date that I first put those in. And so I know like when I'm getting close to that like 7-8 day period of those are the mops that I've been using, I know fish are going to hatch. I don't want to put females back into that because they would eat the babies. So then I just swap it out for a new tub with new mops, or you could just take the mops out, keep reusing the same tub, but you do need to have somewhere for the fish to hatch out into. So I usually just switch the whole thing out and then keep doing that over and over and over again. The record keeping and the dates and the times is a good idea for somebody who's really organized. But for me, I think like last summer, I would just wait until I would check that little tub and make sure that there wasn't any babies hatched out. But the next day I come out, as soon as I see one baby in the water, then I know, okay, it's time to switch things up. So you can do it that way too. And yeah, that tub that you have little baby rice fish in, fish are gonna just start hatching out over the next couple of weeks, and you're gonna end up with a ton of fish in that little tub, which is pretty cool. The little tiny baby rice fish are gonna be soaking up a little egg sac for a few days. You will have to start feeding them eventually. That's where the green water really comes into play. If those tubs that you're hatching them out in have green water, then you have some leeway. You don't need to really add food right away if you don't want to. But when it does come to food, I mean, you just want to use some random fry food. I don't think it really matters what type you have. Legit fish food doesn't make a baby tiny powdered fry food yet. If we did, then I would definitely feed that. But just use whatever you got, just whatever's left on your fingers in the bag. Just kind of lightly put that in there. You don't need a ton of food. These tubs will also go for weeks and weeks before you start to see any nitrite or nitrate in them. Ammonia is a thing that will obviously pop up too first, but it's something that's so short-lived. I've never been able to catch it in these things, and it's not something that will harm the fish. So once you have your tub set up for a few weeks, start putting a test strip in there, make sure that nitrite isn't getting too out of control. If it is, obviously do little water changes. That can be really tricky with these fish because they're so tiny, so you have to be very careful when you do that. You could also just move these to a more established aquarium with an actual filter and not worry about it, but you can keep them in these tubs for a very, very long time. Eventually, they do kind of find a sweet spot where they cycle, and then you don't really need to worry about it. I also like to put some floating plants in these, like some Sylvinia, just so that there's a little bit more of a microenvironment. It promotes there being other things in the tank for these tiny fish to chew on. And honestly, you're just kind of chilling at this point. Like you have become a fish farmer, and that was really cool for me last year, and I can't wait to do it again this year. At some point though, unfortunately, the summer is going to end, but hopefully you have just like a ton of juvenile rice fish to now have a bunch of other fun things to do with. These juvenile fish are not going to be able to overwinter like the adults are. They just don't have enough body mass. They don't have the fat reserves to make it through like 5-6 months without eating. And if you did that, they're not going to grow either. So these are fish that you're definitely going to want to keep inside for probably the entire next winter, grow them up to basically an adult size so that you have them ready for the next season. You can just keep multiplying the fish that you have if that's what you want, or if you just want to have more ponds and more fish in them, then do that too. Where you live and what the climate is in the winter is going to dictate if you're even able to overwinter your rice fish. Like, they're not completely bulletproof. They're very strong, but if a pond is going to completely freeze solid like an ice cube, they're not going to survive that. So there's little intervention-y things that you can do, adding an air stone. Basically anything that prevents a body of water from completely freezing is what you want to do. The top layer can freeze over, like the top first inch can freeze over. It can be super cold in there. Your rice fish, your adult ones, most of them are going to survive. And that's really the preferred way that this fish should be kept. Like, part of why they go through such a strong and healthy breeding season is because they have an extended period of really cold, just chilling, not moving, not eating. That's one of the ways that we can help preserve the adaptability of the fish and not lose a bunch of those really good traits that we love about this fish through keeping them inside and breeding them like all year round, things like that. That's also going to make the fish not live as long. When we keep the fish this way with a pretty harsh winter, it not only gives them more longevity, gives them the ability to live 3, maybe even 4 years. It also just reinforces the strength of the fish and keeps those really good traits that we love about them in them. For me, where I live specifically, once we start to get into mid and late October, it starts getting cold enough, particularly at night, to where we don't want to be feeding our fish really, or we want to slow down on the feeding. Rice fish are stomakless fish, and they have a temperature sort of bracket where they are able to digest food and when they're not. So a loose rule is like a 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's going to be 50 degrees, they're able to kind of digest food, but not very well. 60 degrees is their optimal and where they're at the best. So anything above that is also going to work for them. Those are basically the temperature cutoffs that you need to pay attention to in the fall and the spring. So for me, if we're going to go for a week where the low is just above 50s, that's when I'm probably going to start to put in a little bit of food here and there. And then as we ramp up, we get into May and the low is like, in the 60s, then we're full blown. We're feeding multiple times a day. I'm really encouraging growth and breeding activity and just trying to get the most out of the fish during the time of year where they're going to be doing all of their activities. I'll start to get a few days where the temperature is like 70 degrees during the day. And when that happens, then I'll just make sure to feed in the morning or before the sun starts to really hit and warm things up. And then I just don't feed in the evenings because I know the water temperature is going to probably get down below 50 again. So there's a little bit of kind of a dance that you have to do with the temperature and the feeding in the springtime and in the fall. It's not super complicated. You'll figure it out. And the fish, for reference, takes about 2 hours to digest food. So thinking about that window with the temperature, you can figure it out. And I don't think the fish is necessarily even going to try and eat. Like, it knows that it's too cold in certain circumstances. If it's cold enough, if it's freezing outside and you put food in the pond, like, they're not going to go and eat food. But yeah, once it starts to be full-blown summer and the low is like 65 or whatever, then you're feeding multiple times a day and just really encouraging breeding and growth of the fish. One of my kind of like recent rice fish videos got way too many views, and it also got a lot of comments, particularly from people saying, be careful, that looks like an invasive species. And look, I don't think those people were wrong. The rice fish definitely does possess some traits that are invasive species-y, but at the same exact time, it's also kind of the opposite of an invasive species, because rice fish don't eat plants, so they're not going to eat any native plants if they get into waterways. Rice fish also don't eat other fish, which is another big one. And I think those are the two main things that governing bodies use to classify an invasive species. I guess the only thing that the rice fish could maybe outcompete another organism for is like microorganisms, which is something that could happen, but they're just at such a low point in the food chain. There's going to be so many things that would eat the rice fish. I don't think if they got out even in a place like Florida that it would be a huge deal, or I don't think it would like wreck the environment or anything. And I don't think that the environment where I live, I don't think they could be a problem. The knowledge that I have regarding it is the same that you have. Like, it's a Google search, and what comes up, the top thing is Chinese rice fish, which is technically a different species. But as far as Japanese rice fish go, that particular species, at least in the States, it's not an invasive species, or at least it's not classified as one. I think in the UK, there's actually some restrictions on rice fish, like you're not supposed to keep them outside at all, like you're not supposed to do this patio pond thing. I don't know how much that's actually enforced, and it definitely does seem like that's a preventative thing from the UK government. Like, I don't think there's a rice fish problem that they're trying to pull back on. It just depends so much where you are. In the Midwest, these fish are not going to survive a winter. There's no way. So they're not ever going to be a problem over there. But a climate like Florida, where I'm pretty sure everything that lives in Florida is an invasive species of some sort, that's a totally different story. So it depends on so many factors. As the fish continues to get more popular, I'm sure it'll come up more and more, but I just don't know if there's examples of this fish getting into a natural waterway where it's not a native and causing a bunch of destruction. That's not to say it couldn't happen though, so obviously I'm super careful. Like, I don't flush fish and I don't introduce any of my fish into like actual nature areas, like a real true native pond. I would never take my fish and try and populate something like that with them. And I think that's all you can do. Like, there's certain things that you can't avoid by keeping them outside, right? Like, birds are a thing. They could swoop down, they could pick one up in their beak and then keep them alive and transfer them to another pond. Or something that's even probably more likely is that a bird or an insect or something picks up some of the eggs off of a plant and then transfer that to another body of water. My neighbor that lives behind me actually has a pond in his front yard. So if he magically somehow ends up with rice fish in his pond without me putting them in there, then I'll have another piece of data on this. But that's really all I have from that perspective. I mean, obviously it's something that sits in the back of my mind. I'm going to keep my rice fish and keep enjoying them and just continue to be, I guess, careful with them, even though that's not like a 100% surefire thing. I'm not trying to be super controversial in this video, but I really don't think that what I'm doing is going to cause a problem. Obviously, it's way more complicated than what I'm explaining. I'm not an expert. I don't know everything. While rice fish could escape a pond and end up in a natural body of water, I don't think they possess all of the, I guess, the important traits that would make them or classify them as an actual invasive species like a bunch of other organisms would. So it's not something that I think you truly need to like be worried about. So yeah, I think that is everything that I know about rice fish. I think the only thing that I haven't really figured out completely 100% is the culling and what traits that I should be really looking for beyond like the super obvious ones. So like a deformed fish obviously isn't meant to be, or like the type of color variant that I'm trying to get out of a fish, right? Like if I'm breeding the all black fish and there's one that's like really gray, like obviously you don't want to have that one in the gene pool. And I also want to mention when it comes to culling, that doesn't necessarily mean you're killing the fish. I don't think I'm going to kill any of my rice fish, even my sort of like weird ones that don't make the cut. Like they still make the cut in my book. So we're going to have a dedicated pond just for those fish to live out their lives and breed with whoever they want. And we're not keeping them separate because they're never going to go anywhere. They're never going to be sold. They're never going to escape into somebody else's tank where they, you know what I mean? So yeah, that's my rice fish story, I guess. Everything I know about rice fish to this point. I know there's probably a ton that I haven't learned yet, and I'm excited to keep doing it because rice fish are cool. They really spice up my summer, and I hope they can spice up your summer too. That's everything I know. If you have any questions, comments, something I obviously left out, I do that from time to time. Let me know. Drop it down in the comments, and we'll see you next week with another video. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.